All right, next video lecture, we're going to talk about fluid-filled spaces in the brain. Those are called ventricles, and the ventricles contain cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. And this CSF it's produced in the ventricles. There are little capillary beds in the ventricles that produce this fluid, and then it flows through the ventricles, and it eventually winds up then flowing across the whole surface of the cerebrum, and it also flows around the spinal cord, up and down the vertebral column, and it also flows through a little tunnel that exists right in the center of your spinal cord as well. So there are fluid-filled spaces in the brain. Those are called ventricles. They're kind of difficult to visualize, especially if you're looking at two-dimensional diagrams. And so Visible Body here has highlighted these fluid-filled spaces for you. So on the view, I'm actually using a view here in Visible Body called the ventricles of the brain. So these darker blue areas that you see there are not solid structures. Those blue areas are actually representing fluid-filled spaces. And so over here on the right-hand side of the brain, they've stripped off all of the actual brain tissue, and they're just showing you the locations of those fluid-filled spaces. And if I go over here, and let's see, so that's stripped off the whole cerebrum. And for example, do you see here, now we can see this fluid-filled space in dark blue over here on the left-hand side, and you've got the identical type of space sitting over here on the right-hand side. But you can see that that fluid-filled space there is wrapping over the top of, right in there, over a portion of the diencephalon. And then your thalamus, remember the thalamus is an oval egg-shaped structure that's down inside here, inside this part of the diencephalon. So these blue fluid-filled spaces are called the ventricles. All right, and you have 4 major ventricles in the brain that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And let me kind of restore our view here, bring everything back in. And now that we have this view back up, you can see, let me deselect all. Yeah, there's the corpus callosum, the left half of the corpus callosum, crossing over from the left to the right hemisphere. And so you can see you've got a fluid-filled space that sits right under the corpus callosum, and that happens on each side of the brain. Okay, so you've got, I'm going to hide the corpus callosum there. Well, it's actually, when I do that, it strips off the whole cerebrum. Okay, so you've got a fluid-filled space right there, and then you've got one over there. They're up a little bit higher, and they arc around. And if you're looking at them from the side, they're C-shaped. If you look at them from the front, they almost look like horns from an anterior view. Posterior view, they look like this. It's really easier to visualize these ventricles when you do an actual brain dissection. You can actually see that there's a space. Space is there. Okay, this one, looking at it from this view, the one on the left-hand side over here, the one that's up higher, is called, this one is the first ventricle. That's usually what I like to call it. It's also called the left lateral ventricle because it's more, oh, come on, pen, right. And then this one over here, then, guess what? It's called the second ventricle. And another name for that is the right lateral ventricle. Okay, so that's those two. All right, let me rotate this around. I'm going to deselect those. And then now you can see how you've got like a little tube right in there that is connecting. This is the second ventricle because it's the right lateral one. Here we are looking at it from an anterior view. And you do have a connection over to this ventricle. This is called the third ventricle. Invisible body is dividing it into a left and a right half, but it's really just one fluid-filled space. So that is your third ventricle, all of that area. And earlier, when we were taking a look at this, I mentioned that the walls of the third ventricle, right down in here, where it kind of looks like the beak of the duck, or the cockatoo, or whatever we're looking at here, this is the hypothalamus region down in there. So the walls of that fluid-filled space are actually the hypothalamus. Okay, so that's the third ventricle there in the center. Let's deselect that. Let's move this up a little bit. And notice you got a tube. All right, well I'm going to highlight that whole area, but I want to point out to you that where it's wider down in here, in between the brainstem and the cerebellum, that is called the fourth ventricle. This tube right in here, that little tunnel that's extending from the third ventricle up in here and down to the fourth, is called the cerebral aqueduct. So aqueduct is like a canal that's bringing the cerebrospinal fluid from the third to the fourth ventricles. So what happens is, now you actually have structures, capillary beds. They're not really drawn in on visible body, but you have capillary beds that are sitting, oops, bring my pen back up here. You have capillary beds my program on my iPad here that lets me draw on the screen is not cooperating with me. Okay, let me deselect, get my pen up and working again. Visible body is not showing them. You can take a look in your textbook though. Within each of your ventricles, you have little capillary beds that are located in there, and those are called choroid plexuses. You have some down in here as well on your fourth ventricle, choroid plexuses. And those are capillary beds that secrete your CSF. Okay, so they're capillaries which have fluid on the inside of them, and then they actually pass that fluid out of the capillaries and into these ventricles, and that becomes your cerebrospinal fluid. And then that cerebrospinal fluid can flow. You got that little tunnel there between, that's the second ventricle into the third, and then it can flow through this cerebral aqueduct down here into the fourth. And then if you take a look in your textbook, there are diagrams in chapter 12 which show you where the cerebrospinal fluid goes from there. From one place it goes is down in here toward the spinal cord. And some of it's going to flow right down the center of the spinal cord. Some of it is going to bathe the outsides of the spinal cord. And then the fluid also winds up extending upward and around the whole cerebrum. And that helps make the brain itself buoyant. It provides some cushioning and some protection for the brain, so it's not just bumping up against your the bones of your skull. That would not be a good thing for your brain, and it's staying healthy and functional. Okay, those are those fluid-filled spaces of the brain. I'm going to switch out of visible body for a minute and over here to a PowerPoint diagram. This is a diagram from your textbook, and this is going to show you structures around the brain that help protect the brain called the meninges, and you also have these around the spinal cord as well. We'll take a look at those when we start covering the spinal cord. But this is a diagram from your textbook which is showing you a chunk from your head and the different layers. So the brain is down in here, so all of that area that's kind of colored in dark brown, that is cerebral cortex, superficial parts of the brain. And then in here you've got your medulla where you have white matter. And then up here at the surface This is skin. So they've even drawn your skin in there for you. And they were nice and kind. They made the skin of the head bald. For those of us, some of us feel better about ourselves. And then this whitish layer that they've got underneath the skin, that is periosteum. Okay, my pen was misbehaving again, but this whitish area underneath the skin is periosteum. If you remember, that's a dense, oh, come on, pen. Periosteum, dense connective tissue in contact with bone. All right, so there is a skull bone right in there. And then you've got another gray layer underneath that. That's the periosteum on the deep surface of the skull bone. Okay, and continuing on, we still are above the brain itself. This pinkish layer that you see right there, and also over in here, that pinkish layer, that is called the dura mater, which actually means tough mother. So that is a dense, around the brain, it's 2 layers thick. It's dense, fibrous connective tissue, a very tough protective covering around the surface of the brain. And that is the most superficial layer of the meninges. Okay, so the meninges are a 3 level or layered structure that surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. And the dura mater around the brain actually has 2 layers thick of this dense fibrous connective tissue that's helping to protect the brain. So that's called the dura mater. And then I'm going to erase all of those things. Underneath there, if you notice, there's a thinner white layer, and that's the second layer of the meninges, and that's called the arachnoid mater. And arachnoid might remind you of arachnophobia. You got a fear of spiders. So if you notice, the arachnoid mater is right there, and then there's another membrane right in here that's directly in contact with the cerebral cortex. That is a thin, delicate connective tissue membrane. It's got blood vessels in it. They're not shown here really very well. They're showing you a few of them there on the diagram, but not too many of them. And that innermost membrane is called the pia mater. So it's a delicate membrane. And notice in between the two on the diagram, you've got all these little webby connections between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. So that's where the arachnoid mater gets its name, because it's got all these little fibry, webby, spider web-like connections that hold the arachnoid mater or anchor it to the underlying pia mater. So meninges, you've got 3 layers. The toughest one is the most superficial. That's the dura mater. The middle one is the arachnoid mater. It looks spidery. And then finally, you have a very delicate, thin one that's directly in contact with the brain, and that's called the pia mater. All right, and then not shown on here, but that space in there, in between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater on each side, that's called the subarachnoid space, and that is filled with CSF. So that CSF that was secreted by those choroid plexuses in your ventricles eventually makes it out of those ventricles and starts flowing through the subarachnoid space around the entire surface of the brain. Does the same thing down in the spinal cord, and we'll see what the meninges look like down in the spinal cord on the next video lecture for the Unit 5 anatomy. So we're done with the brain. And you can take a look at some other diagrams in your book again if you want to get a better feel for where the CSF is located and how that winds up bathing the entire surface of the brain. So next video lecture, we'll start talking about features of the spinal cord.